Good morning. Congratulations on making it through the nightmarish snow conditions. There must be, 1 or 2 millimetres out there. It forced me to do the welcome and introduction. My name is, if you don't know, Mark Carden. I'm the director of the Research to Reader Conference. Welcome back those of you who know me, have been here before, and welcome to those who are here for the first time. This is not my day job. I'm really a recruiter with Mosaic Search and Selection, and I'm supposed to be doing that instead of putting all my time into the conference, but this is much more fun, so it's irresistible. First thing to say really then is welcome to everyone. Thank you for coming. Great to have you here. I'm going to do a couple of introductory remarks and a few thank yous and a bit of housekeeping before we then get on to what you're waiting for, which is our opening keynote speaker. So, where should we start? Let's start with a few thank yous. I'm going to come back to some of these, but I've got loads of people I've got to thank during the course of the next 2 days, so I will get round, I hope, to thanking everybody. Let me start, though, by thanking the delegates for being here. Because that's kind of pretty crucial. I'd like to begin by saying something about you. I read in some manual that you're supposed to, if you're at the back, there are seats right down at the front here where I can keep an eye on you. So just come right forward. There's a whole table there. I don't know what happened there. So I'd like to say something about delegates. I did read somewhere, to get an audience on your side, you should talk about them to start with, obviously without insulting them too much. So here's something about the delegates. So, where are you from? I thought you'd be interested to see geographically where you're from. So that's the last 3 years of the R2R conference. And you can see there's a slight reduction in proportion from UK and Ireland, which I consider to be a good thing. We really want to be an international conference, not just a UK conference, never to be being in London. That tends to encourage UK people, but we're becoming more international. I'd like to thank all the Nordic persons who've growing that Nordic contingent. That's great news as well. Where are you from sector-wise? Where do you work? This is the sort of breakdown of areas where you work. Very pleased to see the increase in library representation and research representation. Again, we're trying not to be a publishing conference. We're trying to be a scholarly communications conference. That means we're drawing from across the whole sector. I think this year our programme has particularly attracted librarians, but I hope that they will persist in coming maybe when the programme moves into other areas as well. But we're trying to be a very cross-sectoral event, so that's great news. So, are you diverse? I only have one diversity slide, which is on gender. I didn't dare make this a vertical thing. I thought I'd better make it kind of lateral. But we're in that sort of 60-40 space for male-female attendance, which is good, I think. We're seeing growth in prefer not to say, which I don't know whether is increased poor typing on the form or whether it's people just genuinely saying, well, hang on, is gender such an issue? And it is a challenge, this diversity issue, that last year in the surveys I got criticised for not asking people about race and religion and those kind of things to do this sort of do this diversity analysis. But I was also criticised for asking gender questions, being told that was relevant too. So actually our diversity workshop is going to be very interesting to see whether that can give us a bit of a steer on how we should be tracking that at the conference itself. Just one more thing really to talk about delegates really is newness. So as I say, some of you are new. Here's the kind of diagram. I tried to do a Venn diagram. I don't know whether it's valid to do it with triangles, but it seemed to work. These are the last 3 conferences with the sort of total number of people, and the overlap is showing the overlap people. What you're seeing here is the numbers in each kind of box of overlappiness. I think that makes sense. So there's 35 people in the room, supposedly, who've been to all 3 Research to Reader conferences. Hi, well done. Great to see you here. What that means for this year is essentially that it's about sort of 60-40, 70-30 new and returning delegates. And I think that's a really good mix of old hands and people coming to it new. So I think that's going to make that a kind of vibrant conversation, and I hope that's going to be fun for everyone. To show you a little bit of the internals of the conference. And again, I tend to do this. People don't usually do this in the introduction, talk about the sort of dynamics of the event itself. But, you know, this is your event. I don't like to think of this as being, I put this on, you come or you don't come. I like to think of it as we're kind of all in this as a process. So why not see some of what goes on? Here's kind of an interesting-ish chart of registrations for the last 3 years. And in 2016, we opened registrations in October, and nothing at all happened until the beginning of December. So in 2017, we opened registrations at the beginning of December, and people kind of went mad straight away, but also complained that registrations hadn't been opened earlier. So in 2018, we opened registrations in October, and people went mad straight away and registered like mad, which was great, and thank you so much for that. It's very reassuring to find at the end of November that you have the same number of registrations as you had the previous year at the end of January. So that's kind of cheering. But then it went a bit quieter, and we have more delegates here this year than ever before, and in fact quite a lot more even this chart shows, since we've had about 11 people register in the last 3 days. The admin team would like to really thank you for that, but I'm great to have you here nonetheless. So we are growing, and it's really great to have such a large bunch of people here. I'd like to grow it a little bit more because then I'll stop losing money, but I think we've got kind of a rightish numbers to have a really good event. So, on to the boring housekeeping and administration. This is where I point to where the emergency exits are and all that good stuff. A few things to get through, but I'll rattle through it quite quickly. Wi-Fi, first of all. There is Wi-Fi. Thanks to Ringgold for sponsoring the Wi-Fi. It should say in your paperwork what the password is. It's also, I think, written on the back of your badge if you need that as well. So there is Wi-Fi, and there is a Wi-Fi password to be put in. Don't forget to get the sort of spaces and capitals and things right. But there you are. That's on the slide. There's the password with a space between winter and spring. Twitter, we are on Twitter. This is our hashtag for all the R2R conferences on Twitter, so please tweet away. Some people will be following on Twitter, and if you see speakers and panelists looking at screens, that's not because they're doing their email, I'm assured. It's because they're following the Twitter stream and seeing what's going on, or in my case, I'm looking at the WhatsApp feed to see whether lunch is ready and that kind of thing. But do follow along on Twitter. The other thing I'm asked to say is that it will be tweeted that one of the panels is taking questions on a tool called Slido, and if you look on Twitter, that will be tweeted, or you can go, I guess, to Slido's website, and if you put in the code V454, you'll be able to put in questions for that panel in advance. So that's a useful thing. That's being tweeted about right now, I'm told. Timekeeping is terribly important. Sorry I was a minute late. That's not a good example to set. So we're going to crack through the program and try and keep to time. And that may seem that I'm kind of pushing people along a little bit, but we've got lots to get through, and we want to see it all. Support and help. We have a support team. So the event team run by Ruby Sweeney. There's people with red lanyards. Would you like to come forward and sort of do a little parade here or something, so people can see who you are? But if you need any help, if the room's too hot or too cold, or you've got any problems at all, don't tell me about it. Tell the people with the red lanyards, and they will sort themselves out. They're all just racing forward now to do a little parade so you recognise them, and just ask any of them for your help. There's Alex, Molly, Kat, and Ruby. Cat, you can tell how I said that. There's Cat with a K, and then there's Cat with a C. They're completely different. Thank you very much, ladies. All right, conduct. I'm always asked to say a word about conduct. Please be nice to everybody here, and don't be evil. Name badges and security passes. You should have a name badge. I hope it's right. If it's not right, then complain to the support team, not me, and they will get you a new one. In your name badge should be a security pass as well. You need that to get in and out of the building. Keep it if you're planning to come back tomorrow, because you need it to get back into the building tomorrow. Delegate survey. This is the most important part of the entire conference. In your bag there is a delegate survey. Last year we got it down to a single sheet of paper, which I was quite pleased with. This year it's gone back to 2 sheets. Good reason for that. So Alex, one of the event team, is doing a degree in event management, and part of her dissertation includes doing a survey of this event. So we've added into the survey some questions I have to say, frankly, some slightly peculiar questions, which are crucial to her dissertation. So please fill out the delegate survey and hand it in at the end. I suggest you fill it out as you go along, but it's really important to me to get your feedback, particularly your comments, and it's really important to Alex for her degree to get a good level of response to that. So please fill that out and return it to us. That is crucial. I'll be reminding you about that from time to time. Photography and video recording, so we have a recording of the presentations, but also some informal video and photography going on. We have some students who are doing some of that, as well as Peter Kluwer over there. So that's going to be going on throughout the conference. We hope to do some Vox Pops, so people will be coming up to you and asking you how much fun you're having. Please join in with that if you can bear to, because that is really nice to get that feedback as well. If you don't want to be photographed or video, just say so, and we'll try and exclude you from that process as best we can. Map and movement. On the back of your program is a map showing you where things are, so that should be helpful. Later on we're going off to workshops, which can be hard to find, but again there's sort of maps to help you with that. Also, when you're coming back, you're going to go out to workshops, you're going to come back to this room and go out and so on. I would urge you to feel free to move around. So if you're sitting quite far to the back and you can't see the slides, you should come forward. There's still a whole table empty at the front here. So feel free to just move around, meet new people at a different table when you come back into the room. Fire exits. There's some there, and probably if there's a fire, just leave the building in an orderly way, please. Fire alarm. So there's a fire alarm test at 11 a.m. every Monday, so you look forward to that. That'll be fun. And lastly, at the end of the conference, tomorrow evening, there is scholarly social in the pub. This is a sort of informal gathering of scholarly publishing people, not just from this conference, but all over. And I can give you details of that at the end of the conference, or you could ask the event team and they'll tell you about it, or just Google scholarly social. So that, I think, is all the housekeeping. What is next? Well, the other thank you I do want to do early in the program is really for the sponsors, kind of moving up through from the bottom of this slide. We couldn't do this without the sponsors, and it's a slight tension because there's a lot of conversation at conferences like this about the evils of commerce and, vendors and blah, blah, blah. But actually, those are the people that are contributing funds to this event to make it affordable. And our ticket prices would be 50, 60, 70% higher if we didn't have this sponsorship. So we have some wonderful sponsors. We have a gold sponsor this year, which is Ingenta. We have 2 silver sponsors, Atapon and Highwire. We have a bunch of bronze sponsors who I'll be naming kind of later as we go through the program, but thank you to them too. And we also have people sponsoring specific events like drinks or the Wi-Fi or that sort of thing. And some people's names appear here twice because they sponsored 2 things, which I absolutely recommend to everyone. That's a brilliant thing to do. So thank you to them. Our gold sponsor, Ingenta, is our first gold sponsor. When we started the conference, we had, I offered 1 gold sponsorship and 2 silver, and we had 1 silver sponsor and then 2 silver sponsors. We now have a gold sponsor as well. I'm delighted that Ingenta are stepped up for that. And I'm now going to invite Byron from Ingenta to just say a couple of words, and then I'll come back and introduce your keynote speaker.
Thanks very much, Mark, and good morning to everyone. I'm very, very delighted to be here on behalf of Ingenta to welcome you all to the 2018 Researcher to Reader Conference. I'm sure you'll be delighted to hear, probably more so, that I shall keep this as brief as possible. We're all here to listen to Alison, and that goes for me too. You're not here to listen to me. But I'd just like to say that Ingenta Connect this year celebrates its 20th anniversary. So we've been around for 20 years, which is quite remarkable in this particular industry. And we're celebrating it both by acting as gold sponsor to the conference today, but also with the launch at the beginning of April of a brand new product, the first in 20 years, which is Ingenta Open. And that is a wholly open access, exclusively open access platform. We're already starting to ingest content onto that. I'm delighted to say that we're working closely with the Directory of Open Access Journals and the Directory of Open Access Books. And latest to sign up for indexing is eLife. So look out for that. It'll be coming up very, very soon, as I said, beginning of April, around the time of the London Book Fair. And I won't spend up more of your time now. I shall hand over to Alison, enjoy the conference, have a wonderful time, and look forward to meeting you individually, obviously not everyone, as the 2 days of the conference progress. Thank you very much.
Super, thank you, Byron. Right, I'm not going to do a long introduction in the interest of time. Alison's bio is in your programme anyway, but we're delighted to have, again, following last year, a Brit who's making a success in America and a top-flight publisher. So please give a warm welcome to our opening keynote speaker.
Thank you. Well, I was going to say it's great to be back, but this morning I'm remembering why I chose palm trees over the British weather. So it was, it's my first time at this conference, and I was interested as I went through the program yesterday when I had a chance to look at the detailed program more thoroughly, and realizing that actually I'm going to be touching on a number of the themes of the conference, not just the high-level themes, but some of the overall topics in the workshops and so on. So I hope that this provides a useful kind of overview and pieces together some of the issues that we're going to be talking about over the next few days. As I was actually preparing for my talk in more detail, I was thinking about the two overarching themes, that of research and publishing integrity, and that of a new research life cycle. And I went back and watched Mark's presentation from last year and found myself rereading Kent's piece from the Scholarly Kitchen about scientific publishing at a time of political assault. And I would love nothing better than to stand here this morning and to tell you that our worst fears of 12 months ago had not been realized. Unfortunately, I think in many cases that simply isn't what we found. Like many over the last year, in the US in particular, I've sought to understand more deeply what it is that's driving the divisions in our society. And since taking over at PLOS, I found myself thinking about that more from a professional perspective as well as a personal one. I've wanted to understand what it is that we might be contributing to those divisions and what we might be able to do to help find common ground. In an era of Brexit on this side of the pond and Trump on the other, this wave of anti-rationalism in some ways seems new, but in actual fact it's been accelerating for years. It manifests itself in the growing ascendance of emotion over reason in public debate and the blurring of lines between fact, opinion, and lies. And it's particularly profound in the US, where the founding principles of liberty and egalitarianism naturally lead to a resistance to intellectual authority. In some ways, we've come full circle from pre-Enlightenment folk wisdom to an era in which, with a little help from the internet, we can all be experts on everything. Or as the art critic Robert Hughes described it, we are a polity obsessed with therapies, skeptical of authority, and prey to superstition. And while in the West we're particularly attuned to this shift, it's by no means limited to the West, as is illustrated by the widespread rejection of evolution in Latin America, where according to recent Pew Research data, roughly 4 in 10 say that humans and other living things have always existed in their present form. So the quotes from the politicians here from each side of the Atlantic are perhaps easy pickings, but they demonstrate the way in which the current rejection of expertise has been led by the top levels of government and dangerously fueled by a rise in populism, particularly on the right. There are some researchers who've suggested that there are psychological differences between the left and the right, and that these might impact our response to new information. Conservatives are more rigid and authoritarian, whereas liberals are more tolerant of ambiguity. Psychologist John Jost of New York University has further argued that conservatives are system justifiers. They engage in motivated reasoning to defend the status quo. Yet this problem is by no means limited to the political right. The case study on the left that best illustrates this is perhaps the denial of the values of vaccination. Its most famous proponents are an environmentalist in Robert Kennedy Jr. and numerous Hollywood celebrities, and it's a myth that has spread dangerously thanks in large part to the internet. Close to home for me is liberal, wealthy, and well-educated Marin County, full of San Francisco suburbanites, and it has the lowest rate of vaccination in California. Educated parents making far worse decisions for their children and everybody else's than those with less schooling. Ironically, this has only been worsened by greater access to information. After a brief look at the internet or Wikipedia, we've all become experts. As Tom Nicholson notes in his recent book, The Death of Expertise, The information age has helped fuel a surge in narcissistic and misguided intellectual egalitarianism that has crippled debates on any number of issues. The acceleration of this trend over recent years has ignited new movements in favor of research and reasoning, most recently in response to the election of Trump in the US and the attitude of his administration towards science. The March for Science began to take place. Nearly a year ago, it grew to become a global phenomenon with marches in over 600 cities. This one here is my favorite. It's the penguins at the Monterey Bay Aquarium. The concern about the rejection of scientific fact has been accompanied by a concern about a misunderstanding of the scientific method. If scientists are wrong on occasion about one thing, we can't just assume that they're wrong about everything. A great example of this is the way in which doctors' recommendations about eating eggs has changed. Just because that's been revised doesn't mean that we can ignore all guidance about healthy eating and head back to McDonald's. But perhaps one of the most worrying causes of disbelief is the growing lack of trust in scientists themselves. For example, a 2015 poll found that 69% of Americans think that scientists have falsified information about climate change. And a 2014 Eurobarometer poll, an alarming 60% of respondents across the European Union agreed that we can no longer trust scientists to tell the truth about controversial scientific and technological issues because they depend more and more on money from industry. As a community, those of us working across the research-to-reader ecosystem are passionate about the goals and purpose of science and research and proud of the contribution that we make to rational progress and an informed democracy. But while we can't be held accountable for the latest comment or tweet from Whitehall or the White House, I can't help but wonder if we might be contributing in some way to the decline in public trust. As custodians of the research information supply chain, we pride ourselves on the critical role that we play in weeding out poor quality and fraud and curating what's most relevant and important to our users. So it seems to me that we should be as troubled by coverage like this as the researchers themselves. There have been far too many headlines about problems in research, ranging across biomedicine, but also into the social and behavioral sciences. Clearly, there are some systematic problems with how research itself is being conducted, but as guardians of the published literature, we have some tough questions to ask ourselves. Most obviously, what happened to the feedback loop of peer review? Why did it fail, and what should we be doing to fix it? And in what ways might we be contributing to the publish or perish culture? It's easy for us to push responsibility for that back to institutions, arguing that culture change has to come from within. And while that undoubtedly has to happen, there's a great deal that we can and should be doing to build more human proofing into the system of publication and dissemination through stronger peer review and more transparency in both what and how we publish. So let's use cancer research as an example, a field where the impact of unreliability running through the literature has real-world life and death consequences. The Reproducibility Project for Cancer Biology was launched in 2013 to reproduce key experiments from some 50 high-impact studies over recent years, but pretty soon the researchers ran into problems. Research groups were unwilling or unable to share important sources like cell lines or pieces of DNA. In some cases, the data and other information was just simply gone or corrupted. In many cases, the grad students or postdocs who did the work had moved on and nobody really knew how the experiments had been done, and lab notebooks were lost or had not recorded sufficient detail. Some studies really are genuinely difficult to replicate because they require real skill to generate meaningful results. But there are issues that can be addressed, if not easily and immediately. Those include a lack of funding for replications and the real problems that we all recognize with the incentive systems in research. But there are also some key issues associated with publication, including insufficient, incomplete, and inaccurate method sections, lack of information about resources used, and lack of data about other research output availability. So there's obviously a lot of work to be done to reduce the unconscious bias and the sloppiness in research itself. But I'd like to focus briefly here on some of the ways in which the stakeholders represented here in this room can facilitate and encourage that change, and suggest some ways in which the published research output and the publication process itself needs to evolve. It's encouraging to see from the programme how much work in these areas is already underway, and I'm sure we'll hear much more over the next couple of days, but I just want to touch on a few issues from a relatively high level. A key issue that's been widely recognised is that of the incentives in research. A 2016 survey of scientists by Vox found that, in their view, the biggest challenge facing science was that of perverse incentives. And although the broken incentive and reward system has to be tackled by institutions and funders, we all play a role in sustaining a system in which it is far easier to publish novel, exciting results. And given that groundbreaking findings actually don't happen that often, the temptation for researchers to rush into print, cut corners, and overstate the significance of their work isn't that surprising. And just a note here, my focus here is really on the unconscious biases and sloppiness rather than fraud or true misrepresentation. I think too often those two things get conflated, but in actual fact, they're quite different and require quite different types of action. So one obvious area for us to focus on is to ensure that all of our publications showcase and reward rigorous study design and methods. For many journals, the level of detail can be frustratingly low, even though any true evaluation of the scientific findings really needs to be able to evaluate the data and any underlying information. We also need to be able to recognize the critical lessons to be learned from dead ends. Openness to publishing these can alleviate the publish or perish paradigm and encourage scientists to share their failed results. There are a number of journals that are already doing this, and in addition to being willing to consider replications and negative results, both eLife, PLOS Biology, and Embo Press have introduced policies recently covering scooped research. This is one of scientists' worst fears. You learn that your competitors have done pretty similar experiments to you, and that they've published the results first. And that fear of being scooped has pernicious and wide-ranging effects, and it weakens the reliability of science. Researchers have a tendency to favour quick and dirty experiments that may lead to many published papers, rather than taking the time for careful, methodical work that leads to more rigorous results. So it's important for us to change what's perceived as negative into something that's valuable, and this is especially true for early career scientists. And in spite of the widely recognized weakness of journal impact factor, we've actually had very little success in developing widely accepted complementary metrics. Altmetrics has gone some way to providing this, but there's still a lot of work to be done, and I'm personally interested to see what happens with the relaunch of a couple of initiatives. Clarivate, as you've probably seen, has just launched ISI, and with the wealth of data they have at their fingertips and their intention to focus on metrics, it'll be interesting to see what they develop. And also, the San Francisco Declaration on Research Assessment has just initiated a major push to move beyond the movement of the last few years, which has been focused on getting signatures, to move towards more meaningful implementation of those efforts. And the fact that the UK funding councils have all recently come on board, I think, gives this great momentum. But replication, reward, and reproducibility projects require a sustainable infrastructure to support the increased open sharing of data and other research outputs. Alongside publication of the book or article, we now need to focus on bibliography and data management, the application of metadata, the identification of open research methods and tools, long-term preservation of data, and many others. And we've made a lot of progress over recent years with data. Since PLOS implemented a required data availability statement a few years ago, we've now published over 80,000 data availability statements, and funder requirements are also serving to reinforce data sharing. Librarians also have a key role to play here. They start from a proposition of strength as trusted partners within the institution. But as the range of outputs grow, it's going to be essential for us to focus on interoperability over the coming years. It's going to be the only way for us to ensure access, usability, mineability, transparency, and discovery of open content. And for some period of time, we're going to have to focus on linking the infrastructures we've created over some 20 years or so at this point. And we'll need to rely on standards to link those common denominators together, whether it's ORCIDs for user identification, Counter for metrics, or credit for attribution. Beyond that, our technology capacity is evolving significantly. Driverless cars, artificial intelligence, and natural language processing are all within reach, and in some cases already in our homes. So we need to be sure that we keep pace with how technology can help us identify trends through contextualization, process hundreds of thousands of papers to speed up workflows, and provide predictive analysis. New forms of technology such as AI are going to be able to help us speed up indexing, taxonomical classification, and contextualization. Greater transparency is also fundamental to research, and that's true of the peer review process as much as any other part of the publication cycle. Peer review remains a fundamental tenet of the scientific communication process, but we can all imagine ways in which it can be improved. Peer review across all types of journal is fallible, not only those that apply a soundness-only approach. There was a study published just last week by Bjorn Brems that showed no evidence of positive relationship between journal rank and article quality or reproducibility. And our current over-reliance on a small number of peer reviewers before publication is putting a real strain on the system. It creates a slowness in correcting the process, and it really doesn't deal well with increasingly interdisciplinary research and big data. There was a recent meeting in DC that was co-organized by ASAP Bio, Wellcome, and the Howard Hughes Medical Institute. And one of the interesting themes that came out of that was the way in which the functions of typical peer-reviewed journals are beginning to break down and take place in different parts of the system at different times. The growing preprint movement is providing new ways to share information and to gain valuable early feedback, while rigorous peer review is still providing more formal validation for publication. And at PLOS, our new partnership with bioRxiv adds a further level by providing basic screening for preprints before they're posted on bioRxiv. And looking at initiatives and programs like F1000 Research, we see all of those things brought together in a single platform. The main action point that came out of the meeting was actually a push for journals to publish peer review reports alongside the article. Although many of us also favor open identities, there's a recognition that many communities are not yet ready for that, and so the focus is to try and drive open reports as a first step. A small minority of us are already doing this, but I think this is one of those areas that's likely to become a lot more mainstream over recent years. Digital publishing has given us a means to think outside of two dimensions, but still most content is looked at in PDF and printed. But so much of what's debated is far more dynamic than this and continues to move and change after publication. And so we need to think about different ways of presenting science and digesting it beyond video and audio. While much of the progress we've seen is encouraging, we're still hampered by an approach that gives primacy to the paper. There is no hub in research. Knowledge is a network. Research is not by its nature article-shaped. So how can we facilitate the same conversation sharing and natural collaboration that already happens in the lab and out in the field? I've touched on this before, but there is a real need for better method sections, and I think our standard should be to record methods in sufficient detail that anyone knowledgeable in the field could replicate the experiments using the published data alone. Sharing other outputs, especially data according to FAIR principles, is also becoming essential. And for those of you not familiar with FAIR, that's findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. There was significant progress made at a September 2017 meeting that I attended at the Center for Open Science in Virginia. And this was the next step with the transparency and openness promotion guidelines, the top guidelines. And the idea here was to really look at the next stage for those guidelines and again, how we can move towards greater implementation of those. There was an agreement that every scientific publication ultimately should incorporate a statement that discloses the availability of all of the research products and materials that underlie its conclusions. It's an approach that's highly achievable, has been demonstrated by journals like PLOS One that have adopted data availability statements. The goal of the statement is simply to provide a structure for reporting that information and then to leave the individual scientific communities to decide how to implement them in their own areas. But in addition to this, there is a significant amount to do in terms of culture change. it's easy for us to sort of throw up our hands, especially those of us who've been involved in any kind of significant culture change in our organizations, and realize that this is a really tough proposition. But I really like this framework that was developed by Brian Nosek at the Center for Open Science. It combines his understanding of science and as a social psychologist, his understanding of human behavior and motivation. So what he does here is he suggests 5 nested components for achieving culture change. At the base is implementation. There has to be reliable infrastructure, such as data repositories, that makes it possible to do the behaviors we're looking for. This is a step that's usually sufficient for idealists, but not for many more. The next level, supporting implementation, is the interfaces, the workflows that make it easy to carry out these behaviors. And this next step is usually sufficient to bring in supporters of change. The third step is norms, an informal understanding of what are good and appropriate behaviors, and these are often defined and enforced in small world subdisciplines. Typically, this step is sufficient to bring along the substantial middle ground that looks to its community for guidance. The next level is incentives, making the desired behaviors rewarding. This step is usually sufficient to bring along the pragmatists, particularly if the incentives are relatively broad. And then the final step of policy is about making the desired behaviors required. Policy fills in the gap that the individual incentives can't, and it brings along the rest. So in my final minutes, I'd like to touch on one of the issues that Mark covered in his introduction, and I was very pleased to see that there's a whole workshop to cover this. And that's really thinking about the importance of increasing diversity as a key component of driving culture change. As we all know, publishing and scholarly communication in general have chronic problems with a lack of diversity. Research from The Guardian on publishing shows that while women continue to dominate in the open plan spaces in our offices, the offices around the edges allocated to senior management, where the decision-making power lies, are still predominantly taken by men. We lament the dearth of talent in leadership, but women still don't have equal standing in the leadership roles in our industry. There's some preliminary outsell research data that shows that only 6% of the top 350 media companies are run by women, and just 22% of C-suite jobs are composed of women. But many of these positions are in marketing and HR. And if that isn't bad enough, our track record with other dimensions of diversity is still worse. A survey last year of British publishing found that the industry remains 90% white. Although there have been some significant shifts on the research side, particularly in the humanities and social sciences, we still find very similar patterns across STEM. Increasing diversity can actually create better science. It's not just about who's doing the research, but it's the populations we're interested in that are impacted. There are numerous examples of research that's based on adult Western populations that simply doesn't apply to other cultures and communities. And so while scientists strive to be fair and unbiased in their testing of ideas, the process is still colored by the fact that scientists themselves are human. We can use scientific methods to filter the good ideas from the bad, but the origin of those ideas is still deeply dependent on the human equation. Quite simply, the wider we cast our net, the better science will be for all of us. Beyond the need to move to diversify our own ranks, we have to do a better job in truly globalizing research and inviting the Global South in as net contributors to the world's knowledge production. Our approaches are still almost colonial. On the research side, partners in the Global South are rarely true collaborators, but simply places where we can outsource tasks in the research process. And this has become an increasing trend over recent years, as research grants have typically required some kind of capacity development. But adding a Southern researcher at all to collect data really doesn't develop capacity. Sian Harris at INASP has been telling me an example recently that she came across. An African researcher told her of a US professor who used to name their research center on bids in order for the US researcher to have a place in country simply to store his equipment. When the African researcher told him after a couple of projects that they didn't simply want to be a storage facility but a true collaborator on the project, the US professor ended the so-called collaboration. As publishers, we need to take ownership of understanding the impact of our actions. One obvious area for this is how we make our content available to the Global South. And there are some great resources from INASP and others that can help us work through that. But our actions also have inadvertent consequences. One powerful example of this is the impact that Jeffrey Beall's list of predatory journals had in the Global South. A heavily northern focus automatically labeled journals with editorial boards comprised primarily of editorial members from the Global South were labeled predatory. This wound up reinforcing the Global North as the center of knowledge production, and it undermined a fledgling publishing industry in the Global South, not to mention thousands of researchers' careers. A more positive example of engagement comes through one of PLOS's journals, Neglected Tropical Diseases, although the journal editors really consider this as a journal of the diseases of neglected populations. In addition to the relatively straightforward task of developing content to highlight important health challenges for resource-poor areas, they have an explicit commitment to capacity development. This includes an editorial board that's composed to truly represent the global NTD community. African and Asian scientists each represent about 15% of the editorial board members, with a further 20% coming from Latin America. And to equip and support authors from neglected areas, the world greatly impacted by the spectrum of all of these illnesses, we've worked with our Ed Board members and others in the scientific community to provide free manuscript writing workshops around the world. And to date, we've hosted over 40 of those in the Global South. We all have approached the world with a perspective created by our own personal experiences, and those experiences are deeply shaped by our own socioeconomic, gender, cultural, and racial heritage. Being challenged by ideas very different to our own will improve the scientific enterprise and the publishing process. And improving the reliability and availability of research can not only help to build and educate the public, but can also help to build trust in research and public support for funding and investment in science and research. Thank you. So I think if we have any questions, we have 3 or 4 minutes before we move on, so I'll pause and see if anybody has. Okay.
Hi, Alison. Kent Anderson from Red
yeah.
Link. Nice talk. Excellent talk. Something occurred to me while you were talking about perverse incentives that we might have created when you talk about the change in, or the unreliability or incompleteness of methods. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about anything you've seen around this. I haven't done any research on this, but it intrigues me, whether the increased discoverability and availability of research might have actually, because of the long history of scientists keeping secret what they can't get credit for,
Yeah.
if all of a sudden when everybody can see my methods, I have to keep a secret again. And whether discoverability and availability have actually maybe perversely incentivized secret keeping.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. And my sister is actually in cancer research, and I was going through talking about this with her yesterday. And I think there's that sort of dueling nature for scientists between being collaborative and a desire to drive science forward. At the same time, they are competitive. In terms of methods and other underlying tenets of the research papers, I think there probably is some truth in that. There hasn't been a requirement to share. Certainly when you look at some of the projects across social science, there's a similar project in reproducibility, in psychology, and much of it was simply that detail of data was not recorded. It wasn't seen to be relevant. My husband is actually a social psychologist, and he's been working recently with a longtime colleague of his that's on sabbatical with him right now, and they've been trying to reproduce experiments that he had done some 10 or 15 years ago. And they were finding that really key pieces of the research that you wouldn't think were important, such as the time of day in which the study was conducted, actually in behavioral science, can have a significant impact on the outcome. So I think sometimes there is a desire to hold back the information for those competitive reasons, but I thought also there are genuinely times where things that a scientist wouldn't necessarily have considered to be relevant to the results actually turn out to have a meaningful impact. Okay, well, if there are no more questions, we can finish on time. One more.
That was a great talk, thank you. You talked about the transparency around peer review in terms of opening up peer review. What about increasing transparency of the evidence of the effectiveness of the peer review? And you spoke that perhaps the peer review we have traditionally wouldn't work for interdisciplinary research. How could you see or encourage or incentivize and I'm thinking of grant panels as well as peer review in journals, the sort of data that we would need to assess whether peer review is really effective. How could you encourage the stakeholders, funders and publishers to make that data more open?
I think that part of the challenge is actually, again, sort of coming back to Brian's framework, is probably a sort of stepwise framework, and the conclusions from the recent meeting were really around, sort of a desire for open, as I said, open identities, as well as open review itself. There's a lot of concern about that, especially from early career researchers about having their reviews open, and so I think the focus for now is going to be to try to bring together the different places in which peer review is happening. And I think the ability initially to be able to capture the review that's happening, say, around preprints. One of the things that we're looking at PLOS as we sort of launch on bioRxiv is thinking about the kind of review that might take place around preprints and how we could facilitate our journal editors having direct access to those reviews when they are considering the peer reviews, the formal peer reviews. So as much as anything, I think it's, we're focusing on trying to think about how we bring together the work that's already happening in order to sort of be able, the formal peer review, to be able to recognize that and to be able to use that in decisions. I think it's going to take time for that actually to become something that's more formalized. But I think initially being able to just collect it together and make it available in different ways, using some of the platforms that are out there. One of the reasons we decided to work with bioRxiv rather than sort of doing our own preprint platform was really the ability to sort of work where the community was. There are going to be a lot of different experiments, I think, in trying to look at what review of preprints might look like. A lot of people have different ideas about how that can be most effectively carried out, and it's going to be interesting to see which are the ones that actually drive any meaningful interaction with preprints. We all know the struggle that we've had with any kind of post-publication commenting, but I think there's some real hope that preprints are a more valuable space for that to happen, because it really is an opportunity for people to have a direct input into what's something that is still considered unfinished.
Great, well that was wonderful. Could you all join me in thanking Alison for her fantastic presentation? Right, moving on. So in a moment now, Laura Cox is going to come up and get the workshop process started with some introductions from some of the workshop people. Laura has taken over this year from Bernie Folan in previous years, wrangled our workshops wonderfully, and Laura has very kindly taken this on this year, getting everybody organised for the workshops. So once that's been introduced, you're going to go off to your workshops. After that, there is a break you'll see in your timetable. That break is kindly sponsored by Elsevier. Thank you to them. And then after the break, you'll come back here. But let me just hand over to Laura now and get out of the way.
Good morning. Could I ask my 5 workshop facilitators to come join me at the front, please? Before we just head out of the room, what we're going to do is each workshop is going to give a very, very brief overview of what they're about, so that we can tie this up with the feedback session at the end. Well, oh. generally line up. Okay, we'll do them in order. So we should have some slides as well, which give you which room we should be in for each workshop. Oh, is it me? Okay. Those are the workshops, and they are in those rooms. Okay. So if I could just ask Leslie Thompson from Elsevier to give us a quick look at Workshop A, Open Science Responsibilities.
Hi, so I'm Leslie and I'm from Elsevier, and I'm working with Clive today to try and put forward this workshop on open science. First thing I should say is I have never been a publisher. I spent 26 years in UK research fund councils, and I also was a researcher. So actually, some of the things we've heard today are very relevant. I hope in our workshop we'll provide a safe space for anybody who's interested in open science to think about what it means for your role as a publisher, your role as a researcher, your role as a librarian, or your role as a funder. Now I've got the slides, but I'm just going to keep talking. The whole purpose of the workshop is to provide a space for people to think and to together work through some of the issues. We've already heard open comes with costs, and those costs can be to individuals, they can be changes to people's ways of working. And how collectively do we think about what the future of open science means, and how we all have to adjust or think about our behaviours and the things that we do today that in an open world where there's more transparency, where there's more availability of information, we can help researchers collectively move forward to a more exciting prospect. And I think in the outside world today where the weather's hostile, where in the UK we have a government that certainly has certain issues with universities, this should find a space where we can cling together and think about the future and make it better than maybe where it would be if we weren't working together to try and design a future open research world. Thank you.
Thank you, Leslie. Now I'd like to introduce Phil Jones from Digital Science, who's going to talk about resilience through diversity.
Hi. So I feel like our workshop doesn't really need to be pitched. We've already been advertised twice during the morning session so far. I'm working with Nancy Roberts of Business Inclusivity, and we're going to be doing a workshop on diversity, and particularly what we want to try to focus on is why certain communities, why certain people perhaps don't feel as welcome in our industry or in our workplace as they might, what causes them to be reluctant to join our industry, perhaps why they don't see us as a career opportunity or are completely unaware of us perhaps even, and how we can build a workshop, how we can build, an environment, how we can build a company that is welcoming and actively welcoming for absolutely everybody. Now I want to just have a note of reassurance here. As you know, there's going to be videographers in many of the workshops and sessions. Due to the sensitive nature of what we're talking about in the inclusivity workshop, we're not going to have videographers there. So what people are saying and how they express themselves and the concerns and fears and worries that they have, they won't be recorded. So we've talked about safe spaces already. That, I hope, will allow us to kind of explore some of the more complex and some of the more difficult issues and allow people to express how they feel about them. So, thanks very much.
Thanks, Phil. Okay, and for Workshop C on open data sharing, Robert Summers from the Belmont Forum.
Good morning. So the open data sharing workshop is an opportunity for you to help us shape the future. We are trying to, the Belmont Forum is a consortium of national science funding agencies, and we're engaged in a project with the science publishing community to basically harmonize the kinds of direction, if not requirements, that researchers need to meet in the future about open data sharing, coming both from the funders' side and from the publisher's side and sending the same message. So we developed the beginnings of a framework of what that policy and messaging should look like, focusing on data accessibility statements as a starting point. And we really are looking for your very direct input. And we're going to take this to RDA, and then over the course of the summer work with the Belmont Forum agencies and science publishers to come up with a final policy that we can share at the Science Data Conference in the fall. And this would become requirements language that would be included in all future Belmont Forum grant proposals. So we encourage you to come and join and, as I say, help shape the future. Thank you.
Thanks, Robert. And for Workshop D on metadata life cycles, we have Ginny Hendricks from Crossref.
Thank you. Yes, I'm working with Ross Mounts from Arcadia Fund, who told me just before I came up that metadata sells itself. I find that if you use the word metadata, it tends to attract technical and operational people. However, we'd like to move the conversation on so that metadata is recognized as a method of communication between the different community groups. It's what researchers use to tell the story about their work when they're submitting manuscripts. It's what publishers use to share the information with each other and with readers. It's what libraries and discovery platforms use to tell this story and make the research discoverable. So if you care about research communications, let's have a conversation across the broad sectors of our industry about how we can improve, fill in the gaps, understand why there are gaps, what the barriers are, address the elephants in the room, and educate ourselves about how we can do better. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ginny. And finally, for Workshop E on open access communications, we have Liz Ferguson from Wiley.
Thank you. So together with Katrina McCullum, down here in the front from Hindawi, and Valerie McCutcheon from the University of Glasgow, we have put together a workshop on open access communications stemming from our work in the university's UK Open Access Efficiencies Working Group, subgroup communications. Our role in that group is to identify inefficiencies in the processes and workflows that deliver open access, particularly in the UK, but this does have wider implications for sure, and to identify solutions that make the implementation of open access policies and workflows much simpler for researchers and all of us who try to work with them. So we came up with two critical areas within that group, one of which is permanent identifiers, or metadata on steroids perhaps, and the second of which is communications. We're finding that researchers are still confused about some very simple terms, to most of us in this room at least, green and gold, for example. Not a huge surprise, funders still have a wide variety of mandates and policies which contain some very subtle differences. Publishers and journals then allow people to comply with those in quite variable ways, and institutions again provide variable levels of support financially and otherwise to researchers. So it's no wonder that they're confused. We have run a workshop via Valerie at this meeting last year. We've had a two-day Universities UK workshop. We've explored these issues at Force 11 and at Pidapalooza, and we still have not resolved them. So we are looking for people to come and join us who share our mission to make understanding and implementing open access workflows much simpler and easier for researchers, and again, all of those who support us. So if you have experience, opinion, or just a point of view that you'd like to come and share, come and help us. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. Okay, just before we head out, and we are literally going to head out in a second, as you may know, some of you were able to express a preference in which workshop you were going to attend in advance. Not everybody has been able to do that. I would ask that if you didn't pre-select a workshop, when you're heading off to whichever one you fancy, could you bear in mind the numbers in the room? We've been trying to keep this so that we've got a balance in both numbers and backgrounds between people. So if you find it's a bit full, please go to another one rather than ousting someone. Many thanks and enjoy. Off you go.